I was asked to speak about how we can get back to business after the EU referendum, and I agreed to this before we knew the result. And I've decided that perhaps it would be more interesting, because I can't really comment on the markets, so I'm hoping that the panel will be able to do that. So I thought it'd be more interesting to perhaps perform something of an entertaining and hopefully interesting post-mortem on what on earth happened last week. Now, as a pollster, I think the first thing I probably need to do is perform some sort of self-deprecation. These are my favourite cartoons on polling. I particularly like the tweet last night. I don't know if those of you at the back can read it, but this was on Brexit Part 2. Harry Kane was so far wide of the mark with that free kick that Ipsos Mori have offered him a job. Now, actually, I think this is a little bit unfair, because the polls showed it was an incredibly tight race throughout the campaign. And actually, if we looked at our final poll, and I'm not going to stand here all night trying to defend ourselves, but if we look at our final poll that was released in the Evening Standard on the day of the referendum, we showed just how close it was. Yes, we had remained slightly ahead, but it was very, very narrow. And throughout, we were saying that it was too close to call. Crucially, we also said that 12% of people on that day, so actually we did the survey a couple of days before, but in the days running up, 12% still said they may change their minds. It was incredibly uncertain. So why was it such a surprise? Well, for starters, the public themselves thought 2-1 we would remain. And normally this is actually a relatively good predictor. So this data here is not telling you how people were going to vote. It was not, I'm going to vote leave, I'm going to vote remain. This was asking them, what do you think will actually happen? And 2-1, they thought it would not be Brexit. The bookies said the same. And actually, those of us that have been looking at trends, looking at what we can learn from the past, thought, do you know what? I think we're seeing the same sort of pattern as we saw with the Scottish independence referendum. It got very, very close, but when it came to the crunch, they took one look and thought, no, we're going to tend towards the status quo. And that's what a lot of us, to be honest, were expecting. Now, I'm going to apply a nice, healthy dose of hindsight, as is my prerogative. And actually, if we look beneath the horse race, at some of the detail of what was going on. We don't just ask people the pure question, how are you going to vote? We do a lot of other things as well. There were a heck of a lot of clues out there to indicate that this could well happen. So for starters, I'm not sure how many of you can see the details here, but we've been asking people for decades now, what are the most important issues facing Great Britain today? We have never been particularly enthusiastic Europeans. And actually, if you look over the 10 years, the decade, up until when Cameron decided we would have a referendum on this topic, if we look at the 10 years before, only 1 in 20 people were telling us that the EU was an important issue facing Britain. So we weren't particularly enthusiastic about it. Secondly, immigration. So this same question, immigration is now seen as the most important issue facing Britain. We saw a 10 percentage point increase in this between May and June. Now, this was core to the Leave campaign. The economy. The economy was clearly something that the Remain campaign were really sort of hoping would come through. But actually, if we split this and we look at Leave and Remain supporters, Leave voters were telling us that this is not something that's necessarily going to impact the way they vote. Less than half as many of them were telling us that the impact on Britain's economy was something that was going to affect how they were going to vote. They were voting with their heart, not with their heads. Now, this is incredibly complicated, and if you're interested, come and chat to me at the end. But we've actually applied some neuroscience to some of our survey work. So rather than relying completely on what people tell us, we've also looked at people's unconscious. So by looking at how quickly people react to some of the questions we can ask them, we can see how emphatic, how confident they are in their answers. Now, interestingly, we found that Leave supporters were just as confident that leaving the EU would be good for Britain's economy as Remain supporters were confident that remaining in the EU would be good for the economy. So they truly believed this. The other point is the general public generally believed that in the short term, remaining in the EU was probably going to benefit the economy. It was a risk. So around half of people thought that in the short term, in the next 5 years, we're probably going to be worse off if we leave. But the long-term economic impact was far from decided, much, much more split. And what was really important, I think, because at the end of the day, we're all quite selfish. We all care about our own standard of living, our personal economic situation. These concerns about the economy, the concerns about the impact of direct investment from EU member states was not cutting through to people. The majority of people felt that their own standard of living would not be impacted by Brexit. This is incredibly important. Now, I'm not going to comment on the veracity or otherwise of some of the messages that came out during the campaign. But what I can tell you is whether or not the general public told us they believed them or not. Now, around half of people told us that they thought the 350 million a week to the EU was true. This was cutting through. Now, if you could compare that to some of Project Fear, and, for example, Osborne's UK households will be £4,300 worse off per year, I think this tells us quite a lot about what the public was believing when they went into the ballot box. This was not cutting through. Another issue was that flaky is quite a strong word. It's a bit pejorative, and I don't really mean it in that way. But Remain supporters were a lot less decided than Leave supporters. So 74%, three-quarters of them did not change their mind or told us they'd not changed their mind between October and April. It was 81% among Leave supporters. They were much harder to sway. Now, on the day itself, turnout was going to be huge. It was going to have a huge impact on the results. And it favoured Leave. If you look at this chart here, this shows you how the Leavier, for want of a better expression, regions, turnout was much, much higher. Whereas if we look at regions like Northern Ireland, London and Scotland, it was lower. Now, clearly that has an impact. So what does this all mean? Well, I think we're still all trying to work this out, if I can be perfectly honest, but I thought I would share a few things with you. I imagine you're pretty familiar with these sorts of charts right now, showing quite how divided our nation is, whether it comes to region, social class, or age. And it's probably not particularly controversial of me to suggest, given how we weren't particularly fussed about the EU in the first place, we weren't really, many of us, calling out for an EU referendum, to suggest that perhaps some of the other issues were being wrapped into a neat sort of EU-shaped sort of package. So perhaps some of this is about other issues. I'll come back to that. We're just running a global study now to try and understand what other countries think about the impact of Brexit. What does this mean for them? It's not all about us, frankly. But back in April, we did a global survey where we asked EU member states, but also some other countries, whether they thought Brexit could lead to a domino effect. And around half of them thought it could. And actually, the Italians and the French were suggesting they would be at the front of the queue calling out for an EU referendum. And many of them tell us that if there was one, they would vote out. So, as I said, this isn't all about us. And it's probably not all about the EU either. There's an awful lot else going on out there. And again, perhaps there are some lead indicators to suggest that some of this is about sort of underlying cultural and societal issues. A couple of years ago, we ran a global trend study, which we're repeating this year. And again, there's a lot of data up here. But what we asked was whether people would like, or to what extent they would agree, I would like my country to be the way it used to be. And as you can see, there's quite a high level of what I'm calling patriotic nostalgia. And look at who's top of the list. 7 in 10 Americans were telling us they wanted America to be the way it used to be. So perhaps it's no surprise that some of the rhetoric around making America great again is cutting through. And again, I think what's really interesting with America is that this sort of is appealing to not just Trump supporters, but also both sides. So for the Democrats, they want to take America back, but they want to take America back from the rich, from the elite, from the politicians. For the Republican supporters, it's about taking America back from immigrants and again from politicians. So it's this differential framing of this same problem that's beginning to cut through. Now, I'm not going to try and predict what's going to happen in the US election. I think we've proved we're not that great at that. I have spoken to my US colleagues, and they tell me that it's quite rare for a president to leave office and that incumbent party to return a new president. But they did say, with Trump, all bets are off. So who knows? We could see quite a different look to global politics by the end of the year. Now, finally, I didn't think I could stand up here today and not touch on housing. I'm looking at this more from a consumer side, from public opinion, but I thought I'd share just a few things with you. So firstly, this same question around what are the most important issues facing Britain today. And I doubt you can see the detail here, but at the end of last year, we saw the highest number of people telling us that housing was an issue facing Britain for 40 years. And this was particularly the case for Londoners. So we ran this study just before the mayoral election. Londoners are twice as likely as the rest of the country to say that housing is an issue. It's also a particular issue for younger generations. Again, I'm sure you're all very familiar with these statistics, but we've been running some generational analysis, and we found that Gen X, so those who are now sort of in their 40s, only about 20% of those were living at home back in 1998, when the average age of a Gen Xer was 27. In 2014, when the average age of a Gen Yer was 27, it was 31%. But to end on a slightly lighter note, I thought I'd share with you some data we released just today for the Chartered Institute of Housing, which shows that we remain a nation of homeowners, of home lovers. So the vast, vast majority of us say, so when we ask people, which one of these do you think will apply to you personally, where you'll be living in 5 years' time? The vast majority say, I would like to own my own home. And when we ask them what they would choose, almost all of them tell us that they would personally choose to own their own home. Other than the NHS, I think home ownership is the closest thing to a religion for a lot of British people. But sadly, for many of us, and many of the younger generations, it's perhaps wishful thinking. Thank you very much.